We've seen a lot in the media recently about the bombing of Hiroshima. And that leads us to think, well, where are we now? What's changed? Are we a more peaceful world? Are we going to use nuclear weapons? Let's look at what's happening, because they've developed quite dramatically. Quite dramatically. I'm told that in the United States, there are weapons which would enable the United States to target a weapon at a particular terrorist in the back seat of a car. That's not bad, a missile to do that, to be that targeted. So that says to me, great, civilians' lives are not going to be put at risk, but it might not be that easy. So to talk about the complications with that, we're going to talk to Henry Sokolski. He's the Executive Director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Centre. He's also the author of Underestimate Our Not-So-Peaceful Nuclear Future. Henry Sokolski, welcome to Counterpoint.
Terrific to be able to talk with you.
Well, look, 75 years later, where are we now, do you think? Is it fair to say that because our weapons can now be so targeted and so quick that we can feel some confidence about people not using nuclear weapons or not?
It's mixed. I think the likelihood of their use is less than it was in the 50s and 60s. So that's good. And it's because the major powers that have these weapons, particularly the United States, Russia, and China now, and to a lesser extent, maybe the other countries like India and Israel and Pakistan, but mostly the big countries, the big three, I would say, know that these are not the weapons you use first. These are weapons of not first resort, but weapons that you use if things are not going well. And there are other military weapons, or instruments, I could say, to deal with and take out targets that are not nuclear, and they're more attractive to use. And in many cases now, conflict is conducted without anything hitting anything. I mean, we're talking about a war of words, cyber attacks that disable things. So the good news is there are some scientific military trends away from using weapons that were originally designed to destroy cities, a large number of innocent people. So that's the good news. I think the troubling trend is that these weapons, the nuclear weapons, may spread. And I think we're now seeing another round of interest in this. The Saudis are interested. The Iranians are interested. The Turkish government is interested. Maybe the Egyptians, perhaps South Korea, and if South Korea, perhaps Japan. Once you get a number of these countries in the nuclear status of having weapons, it's not clear where that club membership drive is going to end. It may go quite a ways. If they spread, the prospects of use might go up.
Indeed. And you make the point that you think weaker states are drawn to these weapons because of their own lack of confidence. They think it'll make them safer.
Well, I mean, if you don't have friends and you feel like you're in trouble, the first purchase generally is a concealed weapon. Yeah? Seems to work in the cities that way. Sales in certain neighborhoods are up. So if you don't trust the police, you take things into your own hands. And that is a concern. I mean, in other words, during the great contest between the United States, NATO on the one hand, and America's Asia allies, Pacific allies, versus the Chinese and the Soviet bloc, well, a lot of people were told they'd be taken care of at the high end of violence with nuclear weapons. We would guarantee their security. People are not so clear who's the enemy of whom and who will come to whose rescue at this point. And so unless there is a political realignment, which may happen, but until then, people are probably hedging their bets every which way.
Yeah, sure. How does the development of nuclear energy fit in with this? Because, certain things have to happen before you can have nuclear energy, and that could put you closer to being able to have nuclear weapons. Nuclear energy is meant to be much cleaner than coal. There might be a desire by many countries to shift to that. What's the consequences of a shift to nuclear energy?
Two things. First, if you live in a dangerous neighborhood like East Asia or the Middle East, you've just built a wonderful sympathetic target, which if it gets hit, is going to make a big mess and be a big problem for you. You're creating a rather large vulnerability. Now, you could say, well, that's pretty hysterical or overwrought. But if you read what the history of the Middle East has been and what reactors have been targeted, you get numbers like 13 or more strikes against just about everybody. And I don't think that's going to stop. The most recent entrant was the Houthis, who said that they were aiming their missiles at the UAE's reactor. So you have that problem. And why is that a problem? Well, when you have a sympathetic target that harms a lot of people, the reaction to that could be quite violent and it could escalate. You might even draw some of your bigger ally friends in to protect you. What comes to mind is a sort of scenario of a kind of nuclear Sarajevo. I mean, I think that it's still a little hard to put that scenario together, but it's coming. I think the second problem is the one you allude to, which is that large reactors are bomb starter kits. I mean, they have neutrons that can be used to irradiate uranium to produce nuclear weapons explosive plutonium, which can be extracted from the spent fuel chemically. This is no longer an exotic point. This is something that's been around for 70 plus years. It's an old technology. So, unfortunately, the technology of inspection and the ability to know when and how someone might be trying to divert peaceful nuclear energy to military purposes has not kept up. And what I mean by that is that you can abruptly divert much more quickly than you can diplomatically react to any news that this has happened. In addition, you can even incrementally secret away some of the stuff right underneath the noses of some of these inspectors. And we've seen scenarios where that's been played out. So more here may not be better. And I would just simply ask everyone who considers getting into this as an economic proposition, please do your math very carefully. If there is no clear economic reason to get into this, boy, there are a lot of security reasons to stay clear. And the economics so far have been pretty clear, and I'd have to say pretty negative. But I think one of the key purposes of humankind is to resist logic. So that may not be enough. The invisible hand with regard to economics may not be enough to keep countries from building these things, but it ought to. If it does, then we'll be fine, I think. We have not yet seen truly competitive nuclear electricity yet. It may come, but it hasn't arrived yet.
You're on our end. This is Counterpoint. I'm Amanda Vanstone, and I'm talking with Henry Sokolski. He's Executive Director of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Education Centre. I'm talking to him in South Arlington, United States, and we're having a look at what's going on with nuclear warfare. Kennedy, I think, described the proposition of a nuclear victory as ashes in our mouths. Why is it that people don't get it? But you can be the big cheese on the block with a great big nuclear weapon. But if you fire it, someone's going to fire back and, it's just not going to be good for anyone. I don't see why people don't get this.
Well, it's not that obvious. As someone who worked in the Pentagon, there are certain targets that are really hard. They're buried. And the only way you can hold them at risk is point one of these things at them. In addition, once these things are in people's arsenals, there may not be much you can do to prevent their use, but to threaten that there are uncertain consequences, including counter use. So, we're kind of in a pickle here. It's not like it's obvious and everyone, hits their forehead and goes, oh, gosh, what was I thinking? I think it's more like you have a wolf by the ears. This was a Jeffersonian reference to another institution, which, thankfully is behind us. It's slavery. But, while you've got that wolf by the ears, it's not obvious exactly what to do, whether to hold or to release. And I think until it's clear that the military use of these things isn't absolutely necessary, I think you're going to have that wolf still, held by both hands. It won't be that easy to release, militarily or politically. And so that's the pickle we're in. And so the hope is that military science will make it unnecessary to use such indiscriminate weapons to take care of the targets, if you will, that you have to hold at risk. You can be optimistic, but it takes some time. I think if you take a look at the number of weapons in the arsenal, it's not generally noticed, but even under the Trump administration, the number of weapons deployed has gone down. Now, that isn't because probably they sit around thinking, well, what can we do to fortify the good feeling of man? It's because they don't need them and they figure out what they need. And so military science has a certain power. I don't know if it's going to be sufficient, but it's one of the friends of figuring out how to move further away from this stuff.
Did I just hear you say, in other words, that if we can develop military science even more effectively than we have now, I mean, targeting one terrorist in the backseat of a moving car is pretty targeted, but if we can improve that even more, we might reduce the need for nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't think it's a question. I think it's an assertion. I mean, if you take a look at the arsenal since 87, the numbers have gone down, and they haven't just gone down in the U.S. They've gone down in Russia. Now, they're going up in India slowly. They're going up in Pakistan slowly, and they're going up in China. And we're worried, how quickly, because we don't really know what they're doing. But the fact of the matter is the overall numbers, even with those uncertainties, have come down quite dramatically from numbers around 70,000 to numbers, that are, no more than several thousand. So, that should not be dismissed as some kind of accident. I think it has something to do with military science. And of course, it has a lot to do with our sense of security. So it's certainly one dimension. And I think it should be seen as one that can help if you think about how to use it. Also, it should shape our diplomacy knowing this. Now, there's certain kinds of military science that will go in the direction of not having to rely on indiscriminate weapons so much. And there's others that do. And so you have to pay attention to the whole picture. But generally, an argument can be made, maybe I should put it that way, that diplomacy has generally followed military science rather than the other way around. Now, I think I can make the argument on both sides, but I think there's something to it. In other words, the arms control understandings that brought the biggest reductions after 87 were done unilaterally, even without treaty. And so that suggests that what one needs militarily drives an awful lot of what one can do diplomatically. At least that's the thought.
That certainly leaves us something to dwell on and think about for a fair while. Henry Sokolski, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.